Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. We're going to give everyone else that's in the process of joining just a couple of more minutes, and then we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. Good morning, everyone. For those that have just joined, we're going to start the presentation in just about a minute or two as we've still got people that are logging into the webinar. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar, IAM, Your Wall or Weakest Link. I'm your host for this morning, Julie Smith. I'm the Senior Director of Solutions Management for Identity and Access Management here at Optiv. Before we get started, just a few items of housekeeping. First thing is this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next few days for on-demand viewing. So I encourage you to forward this on to your colleagues who are unable to make it today. You can see here on the console that we have several resources that you can use during or following the webinar. This includes some resources we think you'll find valuable when it comes to your security program, our speaker bio, social sharing buttons to the left, and a Q&A chat box on the right. You'll also find all of these same widgets on your toolbar as you scroll to the bottom of the screen. Regarding the Q&A chat box specifically, I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the webinar and during the Q&A period. We'll be holding questions until the end of the presentation, but please stay on and we'll try and get to all of your questions at the end. If we're not, we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. Now, let's get started with the webcast. Let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, Ian Cumming. Ian is Director of Client Solutions for the Identity and Access Management practice here at Optiv. Ian's role is to provide pre-sales support and consulting to Optiv's clients, as well as providing support and mentoring to other Optiv team members. Ian has over 20 years of experience in both consulting and enterprise environments. His experience includes architecture and design of solutions addressing compliance, risk, and other identity challenges, and customers ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 corporations. Some of those clients include healthcare, financial, manufacturing, and energy verticals. He is a subject matter expert in the major competencies encompassed within identity and access management and is experienced in emerging areas of identity, such as authentication and authorization infrastructures supporting mobile apps, DevOps, and API security, as well as identity infrastructures for Internet of Things. Prior to joining Optiv, Ian was a principal consultant for a New York-based software vendor and responsible for supporting security sales specialists in the Western U.S., covering all verticals in both large and medium enterprise environments. In his role here at Optiv, Ian has responsibility for leading a team of advisors that cover the Central and West regions. In addition, he provides advisory assistance to Optiv's team developing the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Now let's get things started. I'll turn it over to Ian to provide a perspective on identity, your wall or weakest link.
Thank you, Julie. So we're going to talk briefly this morning about identity as part of an overall cybersecurity program, how we see it fitting in, and how we can help you move from maybe a weaker security posture to a stronger security posture by making identity a focus of your overall program. And the reason that we are thinking this way is that in spite of all our best efforts, breaches continue to grow, both in frequency and in severity. And they're not just growing year over year, they're compounding almost. So the rate of growth is accelerating as we move down various new business initiatives and as we expose more of our applications to the internet. So we're looking at finding a new way to address the security challenges by heightening the awareness of identity, of the user, and of the context that they're operating in. This comes from a discussion that I had with a security executive at a client where we were talking about the penetration testing that we had done for them. And he was very proud, understandably so, because we only found one hole in the perimeter of the organization. And just as a educational matter, I asked, well, what happened once they found the hole and got in? And what happened was that our team of penetration testers were given full and unfettered access to the environment. Because once that perimeter was penetrated, that was it. There was no further barrier to get in the way of moving freely through the organization and getting full access to all of the data in there. So when I asked a follow-up, I said, how are you going to deal with this? He said, well, I'm going to plug the hole. And understandably so, I said, and then what? He said, well, I'm just going to plug the hole. And then when they find a new one, I'm going to plug that one too. And it's really because as security professionals, we've been trained to look at breaches in a certain way, and it's the wrong way. We look at it as this is something that is finite, that we can address by plugging a hole or patching a server or, upgrading a certain piece of infrastructure. But when you dissect where breaches come from, right? Employee error, negligence, insider theft, hacking, physical theft, all of these various causes of breaches have one thing in common. And that is that an increasing number of these have to do with stolen or weak passwords. As of 2016, 81% of breaches had something to do with stolen or weak passwords or credentials. So we're allowing people to get access to a user context and then allowing them to elevate privilege because we are not putting effective identity controls in place. So when we look at this as a whole, we're going to assert that 100% of breaches have some user element associated with them. maybe not stolen or weak passwords, but there is an element of the user or of identity that is part of each of these breaches. When you look at what the anatomy of a breach is, attackers want to get an identity. They want to operate under a user context, whether that's interactive user, a system user, a service account. No matter what it is, they want an identity context that they can use to get in, and then find a way to leverage ineffective controls to elevate their privilege. Once they're allowed to elevate their privilege, then they can get to what they really want, and that's the data. Right? So that's why we're asserting that 100% of breaches have an identity element to them, or that 100% of breaches, have a user operation context to them, because ultimately you need that user context in order to get access to the data. And then with ineffective communication of what the identities can and should be allowed to do, any other controls that you have in place for exfiltration are suboptimal because they don't understand the user context and the subsequent use of those credentials. One of my favorite quotes is from Kevin Mitnick, and he's a person who sees things much like I do, in that the weakest link in any security stream is going to be the end user. End users are notoriously fallible. We as humans are fallible, and people are going to take advantage of that. So that anything that we do that doesn't address users' identities, entitlements, and operating context is going to render any of the controls that we put at the perimeter of the organization suboptimal, because once a user gets compromised or a user's credentials get compromised, all of the controls that we put in place to bar against outsiders coming in are now completely ineffective, because that user that was compromised is not considered an outsider. If you look at the spend, where we're investing to deal with security as an overall program, you can see that there's a lot of investment put into network security, endpoint, vulnerability, and when you add those up, that's a pretty substantial investment. And all of those tend to be focused on the outward perimeter of the organization. If you look at the things that address once you're inside, the identity controls, your defense in depth, it's comparatively a very small investment that organizations are making. And we believe that that is why breaches are allowed to grow at the rate that they are and the severity that they are, because the investments that we're making tend to be focused outwardly, and we're not adhering to the best practices around defense in depth. So we need to provide layers of security that we can use to protect the organization. And one of the best things that we can do is investing more in identity and access management, because ultimately that is where you are going to be attacked most. The problem is that traditionally identity and access management has been perceived as a very complex project. It's often been described as the third rail of a CISO's career. They tend to go on for a while, and they are, to be honest, difficult. You have to be a consensus builder. You're touching every application in the organization. You're touching every group within the organization. And it's oftentimes groups that you don't have direct influence over. So that adds to the complexity, but as an organization, the best thing you can do to improve your security posture is to embark on effective identity controls. Another thing that gets in the way is we rely on traditional ROI metrics when we start to look at identity projects. And when you look at the inherent risk in compromised credentials, in misappropriated or misused access rights, it's very profound risk, but it's not something that usually a hard dollar figure can be tied to. So when you look at what the payback to the organization can be, from a soft dollar perspective, it's large. From a risk reduction perspective, it's massive. But we still tend to look at hard dollar savings when we look at these types of projects, especially ones that go on as long as identity ones, and that does a disservice to the organization. Because we're dealing with so many different groups within the company, and because we have to build a consensus, that there's often confusion associated with this, because trying to get organizational buy-in and trying to maintain organizational will to move these projects forward, it's confusing, it's disjointed, and it eventually, if not managed appropriately, can lead to failure. And the last tends to be maybe the most common. We've dealt with single sign-on, we've dealt with, maybe multi-factor or some other aspect of identity, and what you hear back is, well, didn't we do the identity project already? Aren't we done with identity? And that, unlike everything else, when you look at cybersecurity, identity is ever changing, ever evolving, and in constant state of change. So, another inhibiting factor is that identity is never done when you look at it that way. So, not focusing on identity can slow your ability to support new business initiatives. A well-run identity program can allow you to move into new business initiatives much more quickly, because you already have the foundational components in place to support the growth of business initiatives, and you already understand how I'm going to manage users, manage service and privileged accounts, how I'm going to onboard, offboard, and associate users with entitlements. All of these things work together to accelerate and help adoption of new business initiatives. Not focusing on identity can lead to greater and more severe breaches. And I think that's proven out not only in the numbers, but in what we see in the news nowadays around breaches themselves. Not just from an individual breach perspective, but overall from a look at breaches. The lack of focus on identity has allowed them to get incrementally worse as they move on. Compliance efforts can be hindered by not focusing on identity as well. As you know, there's an identity component to most compliance initiatives, whether it's reporting on who has access to what, whether it's ensuring that there is a least privilege model in effect, or just validating who has access to sensitive data on a periodic basis. A well-run identity program can aid in those compliance efforts. And there's a lot of panic nowadays around GDPR and how do we do this? How do we deal with the right to be forgotten? The right to be forgotten is an identity problem. How do we deal with entitlements and access to data? Also an identity problem. So adding to the complexity of the perception of identity is that identity is a part of every major initiative that a company goes into. So if you're talking about mobility or third-party risk or any of these initiatives, there is an identity component to this. And a well-run identity program will give the identity team a seat at the table for every new initiative that comes out, because the dependence on identity for understanding of what's going on and your security posture is so great. What also adds to confusion in this space is that at last count, there were over 3,500 vendors in the security space, each one of them trying to get time on your calendar, each one of them with a new and shiny widget to sell, and each one of them trying to convince you that that is the latest and greatest thing and what is going to be the most impactful to your security posture. And so it really does a great service to have choice in the marketplace, but it's also a tremendous disservice to have so much new noise to go from that you oftentimes don't know where you're going to go next. And how do we avoid the next shiny object syndrome? So our perspective here is that IAM needs to evolve. Back in 2010, identity was described as the new perimeter. And this was an apt description at the time because it said that because the walls of our infrastructure are eroding, because we're moving to the cloud for infrastructure, for applications, the only perimeter that we have left is identity, because it's virtually impossible to try and put a wall around cloud infrastructure or cloud applications that you don't own the infrastructure around. Adding to this is statistics like 1 in 5 employees would sell their corporate credentials for the price of a good steak dinner and a bottle of wine. 1 in 5 employees surveyed. So when you start to look at identity as a perimeter, every fifth identity is a hole. Modern thinking around identity has to expand beyond the perimeter mentality. Identity is everywhere. Identity is ubiquitous. So putting an effective IAM program in place can mitigate your risk in other security initiatives. And what we're saying is that identity is the language of security. It's a foundational element to a well-run cybersecurity program. If you really want to talk security and go beyond compliance, you have to be speaking identity. Because if you're not fully understanding the user, their operating context, their access rights, their entitlements, all of those things, then you're really not talking security. And we need to be talking more about security because we have to stem the flow of breaches. The path forward involves an identity-centric view of security. Because if you master the foundational components at the center of this diagram, every other piece of your cybersecurity program around the periphery can be made more effective, right? And we're not saying that they're not effective now, we're just saying they're sub-optimized now. Because if we understand fully the impact of identity on our cybersecurity initiatives and on all of these areas of security operations, then we can make more effective choices when we're writing rules, or when we're doing data loss prevention or data access governance, as we protect the data, understanding identity is critical. And that's why if you look at identity-centric model of operations, that's where you get the biggest understanding of how each of these areas is impacted by the identity. So where do we start? Before you do anything, assume you've been breached and that the attackers still have access. We want you to look at adopting an identity-centric model, being able to focus on identity and which accounts you have, what they have access to, and first and foremost, securing identities that will allow lateral movement. Those are OEM accounts, aged accounts, privileged accounts. This can be one of the most impactful risk reductions that you can do right away. And once you have taken a look at what the identity-centric model is, we can confidently say, I'm certain that we know every single person that works for us, with us, or supports us, and exactly what they have access to at all times. It's a pretty bold statement, but it's not an impossible thing to do. You have to have the proper investment and the organizational will to do it. But ultimately, when we talk about the critical data we have, right, the PII, PCI, any of these other valuable pieces of data, we want to know with certainty who has access and identify that access. We want to know what privileges are within that access, what they can do once they have access to the data. And we want to make sure that every time somebody goes through to get access, that somebody else is looking at that, reviewing it, and approving it every time we go through that process of granting access. And then periodically reviewing that. Because if we don't have that level of accuracy within understanding our user population, our identities, right, both inside and outside, we open ourselves up to deficiencies in our security control, whether that be at the access control layer or any other layer that we have. So adopting the identity-centric model gives us that level of assurance and of certainty. How we move forward from there is we start at a programmatic level, making sure that we define what our identity program is, how they interact with all of the other parts of our organization, and really making sure that identity has a seat at the table as we roll out new business initiatives, as we investigate current business initiatives, and as we secure current business initiatives. We start with the basics: access control, user lifecycle, and access governance. Because even though you may have gone down the road to do these things, they may not be optimized. If you can't say with 100% certainty that every access right within the organization has been vetted and approved and is known and can be reported on, then you need to back up, step away from the shiny object and get back to the basics and build that strong foundation. From the basics, then we start to move into the advanced. Right? Then we can start looking at how we share identity information and risk information with the other parts of our security infrastructure to make smarter decisions along the way and through the transactions. And this is the way that we eliminate the shiny object syndrome and focus on identity and identity strategy and what we need to do. So in order to move from the weakest link to building the wall, we do have to realize first and foremost that if we don't effectively manage identity, every other security dollar that we spend in the organization is sub-optimized. We have to move away from thinking that there are insiders and outsiders. Once you've entered into a relationship with a user of any kind, whether that's a customer, a business partner, a contractor, a supplier, whoever it may be, being in that relationship with you gives them access to your applications, your business processes, and they are no longer an outsider, they are an insider. As you look at compliance and audit requirements growing and evolving, they're becoming more complex, and you have to be ready for them. So that when somebody asks you, where do we stand on GDPR, you can confidently say, we can give you all the data you need, we just need to know what format you want it in. And finally, remember that identity is the language of security. Every other security initiative that we have and that we embark on can be made more effective and optimized with a proper understanding of the identity context of the user. And that we have to be speaking identity to really be talking security. With that, I'll wrap up the prepared portion of this webinar and ask Julie if there are any questions.
Thanks, Ian. That's great information you provided, and hopefully the audience found it as informative as I did. Just a quick reminder that you can post your questions into the Q&A chat box. We have a couple of questions that have been submitted. I'll sort of take the softball question first, and I'll answer it for you, Ian. Will a copy of today's slides be available? And the answer is yes. We'll be sending a follow-up email out to you shortly that will include the slides, a link to the recorded webinar, and also some additional resources that might be informative for you. So that was an easy one. Let's move on to a little bit more challenging. It looks like a lot of technologies are a part of the identity-defined security approach you mentioned. Are vendors really working together to make that happen?
Well, that's a great question, and yes, they are. As part of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance, vendors are today working together to provide exactly these integrations, open up internal APIs, and allow the free exchange of identity information so that you can get a comprehensive view of what that user is doing, the risk associated with that user's operating context at the time, and ultimately make better security decisions along the way.
Great, thanks, Ian. Next question. Again, please feel free to submit your questions through the chat window on the console. How does the identity-centric model that you mentioned relate to external identities like customers and partners?
As I mentioned, actually, even in the wrap-up slide, there is really no differentiation in what type of identity you have. The identity-centric model treats all identities kind of equally in that we believe that once you enter into a relationship with a user, whether that be as a customer, as a business partner, or as an employee or internal user, that they should be treated no differently one over the other. They should be managed with the same rigor and to the best of your ability, because really they have a view into your infrastructure, your applications, your business processes that somebody outside of that relationship would not have, and they should be treated all the same.
Great, thanks, Ian. Let's see, another question we've got. I hear vendors talk about zero trust model. How does the identity-centric model differ?
So that's an interesting question, because I did have at one of the shows I spoke at, a number of people asked me that exactly same thing when we started talking about zero trust. They asked, is this zero trust as in vendor A or vendor B, or what is this? How does this all differ? And zero trust is usually a foundational operating tenet of any well-run program, because you want to assume that that any interaction with data is inherently held with some risk associated with it. So if you look at any transaction, you want to make sure that you have inspected the user, what risk is associated with that specific type of account, what the risk is associated with that type of account accessing that classification of data, and then what they're trying to do in the context of risk overall. So zero trust is a foundational component to building that risk model and establishing an operating environment where you know fully who the user is, what level of assurance that you need along that way in order for them to perform a specific action on that specific data.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Let's see, one more. Looks like, again, if you have a question for Ian, please enter it into the Q&A chat box on your console. So the alliance you mentioned, Identity Defined Security and Alliance, how can I get involved? I think this probably is coming from a practitioner.
I am actually hoping that this is that the links to the Identity Defined Security Alliance are in our resources. If not, then please, Julie, make sure that that gets in there. But idsalliance.org is where you go to find more information. There is a community aspect of it for practitioners that is up and coming and will be unveiled fairly soon. And that's going to be the way that you get involved. Currently, while there's no community level access yet, you can still look at the use cases that have been defined, comment on them, interact with the other practitioners in the space around the use cases themselves, and even suggest use cases. So that currently is a bit of a limitation, but that's being addressed, and we're moving forward as fast as humanly possible.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Ian. Let's see. I don't see any more questions. If anybody has a question, please submit it quickly here. And certainly, we can always follow up with you directly for any questions that you may have post-webinar. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar for today. Thank you for participating, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. As mentioned, a follow-up email with slides will be sent to you shortly, which will include links to today's webinar recording as well as additional resources. Thank you, and have a great day.